Have you ever trusted an animal with your life? In the rugged heart of the Colorado Rockies, a lone trapper's 3 stubborn donkeys refused to walk the trail, dragging him toward a deadly, uncharted ravine. He thought the beasts had gone mad. What he found at the bottom changed his life forever. The wind howled like a wounded beast down the Uncompahgre Gorge, carrying the bitter promise of an early and unforgiving winter. It was November of 1888. And Lucas Montgomery was a man who preferred the company of the biting cold over the chatter of civilized society. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a beard the color of rusted iron and eyes weathered to a pale, piercing gray, Lucas was a true mountain man. He had retreated to the high country of the San Juan Mountains after the war, leaving behind a world he no longer understood. His only companions in this isolated existence were 3 mismatched, spectacularly stubborn donkeys: Barnaby, Clementine, and a massive, ill-tempered gray jack he called Goliath. To a mountain man, pack animals are the difference between a prosperous winter and freezing to death in a snowdrift. Lucas knew his donkeys, and they knew him. They had a rhythm, an unspoken language of tugs, brays, and ear flicks. But on a freezing Tuesday morning, that rhythm shattered. Lucas had packed the trio with a season's worth of cured pelts, aiming to make the long, treacherous descent into the mining town of Silverton to trade for coffee, flour, and black powder before the passes snowed in entirely. They were barely 3 miles from his cabin, approaching the treacherous fork at Weeping Pine Ridge, when the trouble began. The main trail to Silverton veered sharp right, hugging the safety of the granite wall. To the left lay a steep, crumbling shale slope that plummeted into a deep, dark ravine known to local trappers as Dead Man's Drop. No one went down there. The tree cover was too dense, the incline too steep, and the bottom was a graveyard of jagged boulders. As Lucas stepped toward the right fork, the lead rope went taut in his gloved hand. He turned, expecting to see that Goliath had snagged a pack on a low branch. Instead, he saw all 3 donkeys standing shoulder to shoulder, their hooves firmly planted in the frozen dirt, their large heads turned uniformly to the left, staring down into the abyss of Dead Man's Drop. "Come on, you hard-headed mules," Lucas grunted, giving the rope a sharp tug. Goliath snorted, a plume of white steam billowing from his nostrils, and took a deliberate step backward. Clementine, usually the most docile of the bunch, let out a distressed, high-pitched bray and stamped her front hooves. Barnaby did something he had never done in 5 years on the trail. He lunged forward, clamped his flat teeth onto the thick wool of Lucas's coat sleeve, and violently yanked the mountain man toward the edge of the cliff. "Whoa! Have you lost your minds?" Lucas shouted, batting the donkey away and digging his own boots into the dirt to stop from sliding over the edge. He checked the wind, sniffing the air for the musky scent of a mountain lion or the foul odor of a grizzly. Animals often acted erratic when a predator was near, but the wind smelled only of pine needles and impending snow. He fought them for nearly an hour. He tried pulling. He tried pleading. He even tried blindfolding Goliath to lead him past the fork. Nothing worked. The donkeys fought back with a coordinated desperation, pulling against their halters, straining their thick necks toward the sheer drop. Eventually, frustrated and losing daylight, Lucas conceded. He tied them to a sturdy ponderosa pine, unpacked their heavy loads, and marched them back to the cabin, thoroughly defeated. The next morning, Lucas tried again. The result was identical. At the exact same spot on Weeping Pine Ridge, the 3 animals planted their hooves, brayed into the hollow wind, and violently pulled toward the deadly ravine. By the 3rd day, the mystery had gnawed a hole in Lucas's pragmatic mind. The donkeys weren't just being stubborn. They were frantic. They were trying to tell him something. "All right," Lucas muttered on the morning of the 3rd day, pulling his Winchester rifle from its leather scabbard and checking the action. "Let's see what the devil is down there." Instead of fighting them at the fork, Lucas dropped the lead rope. Immediately, Goliath, Barnaby, and Clementine scrambled over the ridge. They navigated the treacherous sliding shale with an eerie, desperate grace, their small hooves finding footholds in the crumbling rock where a man would have plummeted to his death. Lucas followed cautiously, sliding on his heels, grabbing onto roots and scrub oak to slow his descent. The canopy of ancient pines closed over them, plunging the ravine into a cold blue twilight. The descent took nearly an hour, the sound of dislodged rocks echoing like gunshots in the narrow canyon. When they finally reached the bottom, the donkeys stopped in a small clearing beside a half-frozen creek. They stood in a circle, their heads lowered, their ears swiveled forward. Lucas stepped off the final ledge, his boots crunching on the frost-heaved ground. The air down here was stagnant and smelled of crushed spruce, wet earth, and something metallic and sharp, blood. He raised his rifle, stepping through a thick thicket of dormant blackberry bushes. As he cleared the brush, his breath caught in his throat. Resting at the bottom of the gorge, half submerged in the icy creek, was not an animal carcass or a lost prospector's camp. It was a high society carriage, a brougham, painted a deep, lacquered burgundy, complete with gilded trim. It was a vehicle meant for the paved streets of Denver or Chicago, violently out of place in the brutal Colorado wilderness. The carriage was shattered, its heavy wooden wheels splintered, the velvet-lined doors ripped from their hinges by the brutal fall. Lucas approached cautiously. The horses were gone, the leather traces slashed clean through with a knife, indicating someone had been down here after the crash. But that wasn't what sent a chill down his spine. As he ran his calloused hand along the splintered side of the carriage, his fingers brushed against a series of deep, splintered holes in the woodwork. Bullet holes. This carriage hadn't slipped off the mountain pass by accident. It had been driven off. Clementine stepped forward, nudging her soft gray nose against a pile of debris near the overturned cab, letting out a soft, low whinny. Lucas moved in, his boots splashing in the frigid, ankle-deep water of the creek. Underneath a tangled mess of broken mahogany paneling and heavy wool carriage blankets, he saw it. A hand. It was pale, delicate, and trembling. The fingers adorned with a gold signet ring that caught the faint sliver of sunlight piercing the canyon roof. He threw his rifle over his shoulder and grabbed the heavy wooden debris, his massive shoulders straining as he heaved the shattered roof of the carriage off the victim. Lying in the wreckage was a woman. She was covered in dust, her elaborate dark green traveling gown torn and soaked through with freezing mud and blood. A severe laceration ran along her temple, the blood having dried into a dark crust against her porcelain skin. Despite the horrific nature of the crash, she was breathing, her chest rising and falling in shallow, ragged gasps. "Lord Almighty," Lucas whispered, dropping to his knees. He reached out to check the pulse at her neck, but before his fingers could graze her skin, the pile of velvet blankets shifted. In a flash of movement that belied her broken state, the woman rolled onto her side. Lucas found himself staring directly down the twin barrels of a silver-plated Remington Derringer. The woman's eyes fluttered open. They were a striking, vivid hazel filled with pain, exhaustion, and a fierce, feral determination. Her hand was shaking violently from the cold and blood loss, but the pistol remained leveled directly at the bridge of Lucas's nose. "One step closer, and I'll paint these rocks with your brains," she rasped, her voice a fragile whisper of defiance. Lucas froze, his hands slowly rising to his shoulders. He couldn't help but let a wry, impressed smirk touch the corner of his lips. "Well, aren't you a firecracker?" he said, keeping his voice low, a slow, calming rumble. "You might want to lower the iron, miss. The only thing I'm aiming to steal today is you away from the cold. You've been down here for 3 days. It's a miracle you haven't frozen solid." The woman's gaze darted from Lucas's weathered face to the 3 donkeys standing quietly behind him, then back to his eyes. She seemed to be weighing whether the giant, fur-clad mountain man was a savior or one of the men who had sent her over the cliff. The exhaustion finally won. Her eyes rolled back, the Derringer slipping from her numb fingers into the creek with a soft splash, and she fell unconscious. Lucas exhaled a breath he didn't realize he was holding. He quickly pulled his heavy wool coat off and draped it over her shivering form. As he moved to lift her, he noticed a heavy iron chain protruding from the sleeve of her ruined gown. He traced the chain down to her left wrist, where it was secured by a thick steel cuff. The other end of the chain was padlocked to a heavy, black iron lockbox, about the size of a family Bible, buried beneath the carriage seats. Whoever this woman was, she was quite literally shackled to her secrets. Lucas knew he couldn't leave the box, and he didn't have the tools to pick a heavy Chicago steel padlock down in the ravine. With a heavy sigh, he grabbed an axe from his pack, placed the chain over a flat boulder, and brought the heavy blade down with a deafening clang, shattering a link in the chain. He gathered the woman into his arms. She was incredibly light, feeling as fragile as a hollow-boned bird against his broad chest. He carried her to Goliath. The massive gray donkey, usually prone to biting and kicking if loaded incorrectly, stood perfectly still, his ears pinned back in concentration. Lucas gently laid the woman across the saddlebags, securing her with soft rope so she wouldn't slip during the climb. He hoisted the heavy iron lockbox and strapped it to Barnaby's back. "All right, boys." "Clementine," Lucas said, looking at the treacherous, nearly vertical slope they now had to climb. "You dragged me down here. Now you gotta help me get her out." The climb out of Dead Man's Drop was agonizing. For 3 grueling hours, Lucas pushed, pulled, and practically carried the animals and the unconscious woman up the loose shale. His muscles burned, his lungs screamed for oxygen in the thin mountain air, and his hands were bloodied from gripping jagged rocks. But the donkeys seemed possessed by a singular purpose, digging in their hooves and refusing to quit until they finally crested Weeping Pine Ridge just as the sun dipped behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky in bruised purples and bloody reds. Back at his remote cabin, Lucas laid the woman on his own cot near the stone fireplace. He stoked the fire until the small, timber-framed room was stiflingly warm. Utilizing skills learned on the brutal battlefields of Gettysburg, he went to work. He cleaned and stitched the deep gash on her forehead, splinted her fractured left arm, and forced hot, honey-sweetened willow bark tea past her pale lips to fight the fever he knew was coming. For 2 days, she drifted in and out of a delirious fever dream. She muttered names Lucas didn't know: Jeremiah, Beaumont, and over again the name Josiah Cleary. Whenever she said that last name, her body would seize with terror, her uninjured hand clawing desperately at the iron cuff still attached to her wrist. On the evening of the 3rd day, the fever finally broke. Lucas was sitting by the fire, whittling a piece of cedar and watching the flames dance, when he heard a soft rustling from the cot. He turned to see the woman sitting up. She was pale, her arm bound in a splint, a clean white bandage wrapped around her head. She looked around the rustic, fiercely tidy cabin, her eyes finally landing on Lucas. Then, she looked down at the heavy iron box sitting on the floor near her boots. "You saved my life," she said, her voice stronger now, carrying the refined, educated cadence of Eastern boarding schools, sharp and clear against the rugged backdrop of the cabin. "My donkeys saved your life, miss," Lucas replied, not looking up from his whittling. "I just did the heavy lifting. Name's Lucas. Lucas Montgomery." "Nora," she said, pulling the wool blanket up to her chin. "Nora Hastings." Lucas stopped his knife mid-carve. The Hastings family owned half the rail lines running out of Denver. They were railway royalty, the kind of people who bought politicians like penny candy. "Well, Miss Hastings," Lucas said, standing up and tossing the cedar shavings into the fire, "do you want to tell me why railway royalty was driven off a cliff in my mountains? And more importantly, who was shooting at you?" Nora's hazel eyes darkened. The vulnerability vanished, replaced by a cold, hardened steel that surprised Lucas. She looked at the iron box, then back at him. "They weren't trying to kill me, Mr. Montgomery," Nora said quietly. "They were trying to take what's in this box. And if the man leading them, Josiah Cleary, finds out I'm still alive, he will burn this entire mountain range to the ground to finish the job." The fire popped, sending a shower of orange sparks up the soot-stained chimney. Lucas stared at the battered iron box, then back at Nora. The name Josiah Cleary carried a dark weight in the Colorado Territory. He was a former Pinkerton agent who had traded his badge for the lucrative, blood-soaked business of railroad expansion, acting as the ruthless chief enforcer for a rogue faction within the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad. With her good hand, Nora reached up and unclasped a heavy gold locket from her neck. She pressed a hidden catch, and instead of a portrait, a small, jagged iron key fell into her palm. She handed it to Lucas. "Open it," she whispered. Lucas fitted the key into the heavy Chicago steel padlock. It turned with a satisfying click. He threw back the lid. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 3 thick, leather-bound ledgers and a stack of signed affidavits. "My father, Jeremiah Hastings, didn't die of a sudden heart failure, Mr. Montgomery," Nora said. her voice shaking with a potent mix of grief and rage. Cleary poisoned him. My father had discovered that Cleary was using company funds to hire mercenaries, border ruffians, and outlaws to burn out homesteaders and miners who refused to sell their land claims in the San Juans. Cleary was stealing federal land grants, putting the deeds under dummy corporations, and wiping out anyone in his way. She gestured to the box. Those ledgers trace every stolen dollar and every drop of blood back to Cleary. I secured them the night of my father's funeral. I was trying to reach Durango to deliver them to federal judge Isaac Parker's deputies. Cleary's men caught up to my carriage at the pass. Lucas slowly closed the box. The gravity of the situation settled over the small cabin like a thick winter fog. If Cleary knew Nora had survived the drop, he wouldn't just send men, he would send an army. Over the next week, a heavy snowstorm locked the mountain in, buying them precious time. Nora's strength returned slowly. The spoiled heiress of Denver high society faded, replaced by a woman of profound grit. She learned to tend the fire, to brew pine needle tea to ward off scurvy, and she spent hours talking with Lucas. They were two people from vastly different worlds, yet bound by a shared quietness of the soul. Nora learned that Lucas had been a Union sharpshooter at Gettysburg, a man who had seen so much death he sought the absolute solitude of the high peaks to forget the smell of gunpowder. Lucas, in turn, found himself captivated by her fierce intellect and her refusal to break under the weight of her trauma. He admired the way she treated his animals, especially the notoriously cranky Goliath, who had taken to resting his massive gray head in Nora's lap whenever she sat by the hearth. A quiet, unspoken romance began to bloom between them, rooted not in the frivolous flirtations of ballrooms, but in the raw, honest reality of survival. Lucas found himself lingering when he changed her bandages, his rough, calloused hands surprisingly gentle against her skin. Nora found herself watching the broad, steady line of his shoulders as he chopped wood, feeling a sense of absolute safety she hadn't known since she was a child. But the mountain's peace was an illusion. On the 9th morning, the blizzard finally broke, leaving the world blindingly white and deathly still. Lucas was outside breaking ice in the water trough when Clementine let out a sharp, panicked bray. Barnaby and Goliath immediately joined in, pacing frantically in their corral, their ears pinned flat against their skulls. Lucas didn't hesitate. He dropped his axe, sprinted into the cabin, and bolted the heavy oak door. "Get away from the windows," Lucas ordered, tossing Nora his heavy Colt Navy revolver. "The donkeys smell trouble, and it ain't a mountain lion." He grabbed his Winchester and peered through a knothole in the shutter. Down the snow-covered trail, emerging from the tree line like phantoms, were 5 men on horseback. They wore heavy duster coats, their faces obscured by wool scarves. Leading them was a man on a massive black roan, Josiah Cleary. "They found the tracks," Lucas muttered, jacking a shell into the chamber. "Or they found the broken carriage chain." "Lucas," Nora said, her voice tight but steady. She cocked the hammer of the heavy revolver, holding it with her good hand, resting the barrel on the table for stability. "I will not let them take that box." "They ain't taken anything today," Lucas replied, his eyes narrowing to cold, gray slits. A voice boomed across the snowy clearing. "Miss Hastings, we know you're in there." The trapper's trail was easy enough to follow. "Send out the box, and we'll make this quick. Make us come in, and we'll burn you both alive." Lucas didn't answer with words. He kicked the shutter open an inch, leveled the Winchester, and fired. The sharp crack echoed off the canyon walls. Cleary's black roan reared as the bullet took off the hat of the man riding beside him. Chaos erupted. Cleary's men dove from their horses, taking cover behind the woodpile and the large snowdrifts, unleashing a hail of bullets on the cabin. Lead tore through the timber walls, shattering crockery and sending splinters flying. Lucas fired methodically, his sharpshooter training taking over. He dropped one mercenary trying to flank the rear window, then pinned 2 more behind the woodpile. But there were too many of them, and Lucas was running low on ammunition. "We can't hold them here," Lucas shouted over the deafening roar of gunfire. "They'll throw a lantern on the roof and smoke us out. We have to make a run for the high pass." Nora nodded. She grabbed the iron box and shoved it into a canvas burlap sack. Lucas threw open the back door of the cabin, which led directly into the attached livestock lean-to. The donkeys were terrified, kicking at their stalls. Working with frantic speed, Lucas threw a saddle on Goliath and strapped the burlap sack tight against the saddle horn. "You're riding Goliath," Lucas told Nora, lifting her into the saddle. "He's the strongest. Barnaby and Clementine will follow him." Lucas grabbed his rifle, threw open the rear paddock gate, and slapped Goliath's flank. "Go, Hia!" The 3 donkeys bolted into the deep snow, carving a path toward the treacherous, winding trail of Red Mountain Pass. Lucas ran behind them, using the animals as cover as they plunged into the dense spruce forest. Back at the cabin, Cleary saw the movement. "They're making a run for it. Mount up!" The chase was a grueling, agonizing slog through waist-deep snow. The donkeys, adapted to the harsh mountain terrain, moved with surprising speed, their small hooves punching through the crust. But Cleary's men were on long-legged horses, and despite the snow, they were closing the distance. For 2 hours, Lucas and Nora pushed higher into the freezing altitude. The air grew perilously thin. The trail narrowed until it was nothing more than a precarious shelf carved into the side of a massive granite cliff. To their right was a sheer rock wall. To their left, a dizzying 500-foot drop into a jagged gorge. It was a deadly choke point. And they were out of time. A bullet ricocheted off the granite wall inches from Lucas's head, showering him with rock dust. Cleary and 2 of his remaining men had rounded the bend, trapping them on the narrow ledge. There was nowhere left to run. "It's over, Montgomery!" Cleary yelled, dismounting his horse and drawing a pair of gleaming silver revolvers. The wind howled, whipping his dark duster around his ankles. "Throw down the rifle! Toss the box over the edge, Miss Hastings, or I shoot your mountain man in the gut and let him bleed out in the snow." Lucas was out of rifle rounds. He dropped the Winchester, his hand hovering near his hunting knife. Nora sat atop Goliath, her face pale, the iron box clutched tightly against her chest. She looked down at the horrifying drop, then back at Lucas. "Do it, Nora!" Lucas yelled. "Your life is worth more than those papers." But Nora's eyes locked onto Cleary, burning with the memory of her father. "No," she said softly. Cleary sneered, raising his revolvers. "Suit yourself." He cocked the hammers. But before his finger could squeeze the triggers, something massive moved. Goliath, the giant gray donkey who had stood frozen on the ridge days ago, who had stubbornly refused to let Lucas pass by the wreckage of the carriage, suddenly lowered his massive head. The beast let out an earth-shattering demonic bray, a sound of pure, primal fury that echoed like a war horn across the canyon. Instead of bolting away from the gunfire, Goliath charged. He lunged forward on the narrow, icy ledge. Cleary's eyes went wide with shock. He fired blindly, the bullets grazing the donkey's thick shoulder, but 1,000 pounds of angry muscle and bone was already in motion. Goliath hit Cleary square in the chest. The impact lifted the ruthless enforcer off his boots. Cleary screamed, his arms flailing wildly as he was hurled backward over the sheer edge of the cliff. His scream faded into the roaring wind, swallowed by the abyss, just as Nora's carriage had been. Cleary's remaining 2 men stared in absolute horror at the plunging drop, then at the massive gray beast now stomping its hooves and snorting blood and steam. Without a word, the men dropped their weapons, mounted their horses, and fled back down the mountain in a blind panic. Silence fell over the pass, broken only by the howling wind. Lucas rushed forward, grabbing Goliath's bridle to steady the trembling animal. He checked the graze on the donkey's shoulder. It was shallow, a lucky flesh wound. He looked up at Nora. She was shaking violently, tears finally streaming down her dirt-smudged cheeks. Lucas reached up, wrapping his massive arms around her waist, and pulled her down from the saddle, burying his face in her coat. "You're safe," he whispered fiercely into her hair. "It's over." Nora clung to him, her fingers digging into his broad back. She looked at the 3 donkeys, Clementine, Barnaby, and the heroic Goliath, who was now calmly chewing on a frozen patch of scrub oak, as if he hadn't just thrown a man off a mountain. "They brought us here," Nora whispered, looking around the treacherous pass. "They brought you to me, and they saved us both." 4 days later, Lucas and Nora rode into the booming town of Durango. They walked straight into the federal marshal's office and placed the iron box on the desk. The revelation of the ledgers sent shockwaves through the Colorado territory. Cleary's mercenary ring was rounded up, corrupt politicians were indicted, and the stolen land grants were returned to the homesteader families. Nora inherited full control of her father's railway empire, securing her place as one of the wealthiest women in the West. Denver society expected the young heiress to return to her mansions and ball gowns. They waited for her to take her rightful place among the elite. But Nora Hastings had been changed by the mountain, and by the man who lived upon it. She sold the Denver mansion. Instead, she bought a massive, sprawling tract of pristine valley land at the base of the San Juan Mountains, miles away from the smoke and noise of the city. There, a grand but rustic timber ranch was built. On the wide porch, overlooking a meadow framed by snow-capped peaks, Lucas Montgomery sat in a rocking chair, whittling a piece of cedar, no longer a solitary mountain man hiding from the world. Beside him sat his wife, Nora, her hazel eyes bright with life, a gold locket resting over her heart. And out in the green, sunlit pasture, grazing on the sweetest clover money could buy, were 3 incredibly spoiled donkeys. They never had to carry a heavy pack again, living out their days as the undisputed kings of the valley, the stubborn, brilliant beasts that had pulled 2 lost souls together right at the edge of the world. If you loved this incredible true tale of survival, romance, and 3 heroic donkeys, hit that like button and share this video with your friends. Don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss another wild historical ride. What would you have done if you found that carriage? Let us know in the comments below. We bring you thrilling, untold stories every single week. See you soon.